The mail-order bride showed up in tears when a cowboy chose honor over vengeance. The dust hung thick and cruel in the air, a choking red shroud over the pathetic remnants of Blackwood, Arizona, 1888. It wasn't a town so much as a wound in the earth, a scar left by men who clawed at rock for a vein of promise and struck only greed. Wind rattled the warped shutters of the Vulture's Roost saloon and moaned along the alley where two dogs, bony as fence rails, argued in whispers over a scrap of jerky paper. The street itself had the burned-out stare of a drunk who'd sworn to go straight tomorrow and forgotten what day it was. At the center of that wasted gaze stood a rude platform, 3 planks hammered across 2 whiskey barrels, where they had set a human being the way one sets a sack of wheat. Serafina Vance tried not to sway in the grit-sour wind. The rope across her wrists had bitten long enough to leave a geography, raw ridges, angry welts, swollen blue. Her dress cream when it boarded a train in St. Louis wore Blackwood now, a uniform of ochre and shame. Honey, blonde hair escaped its pins and filmed her face like a veil she had not chosen. Behind her eyes, a library of remembered rooms burned. A piano with a missing ivory key, a lamplight at supper, a small mirror where a girl once believed life would politely open for her if she knocked. $50, bawled the auctioneer, a man whose flesh felt poured into his skin and left to congeal. Do I hear 60? Strong back, sound teeth, good for cookin', cleanin', and anything else a man might require. His grin opened like a canyon, and the canyon answered with laughter. A ring of miners, drifters, and day-worn gamblers regarded Serafina with the same appraisal they gave a mule. Hocks, teeth, the chance she'd found her. One muttered a prayer you could not hear. 2 others licked their lips as if sin were soup. Thomas had promised her a life out here, her Thomas, with the gentleman's cufflinks he'd inherited, and the gambler's luck he believed God owed him. Luck had taken its tithe and more. Now the bill fell on the only thing Thomas could trade that still had value in a place where decency was bankruptcy: his wife. He had not been brave enough to stay and watch his debt collected. 60, someone slurred. 65, crowed another. The auctioneer's hand pinched her upper arm and rolled the muscle under his thumb as if he were choosing fruit. A reminder of how she got here. He jeered, tugging the rope to show the crowd a trickle of blood. The laughter hit Serafina like thrown sand. She kept her chin up by a margin you could measure with a needle. Some part of her thin as a last thread looked past the faces and the tobacco spit, past the sun-stabbed awnings, and found a figure that did not fit. He stood at the edge of the crowd as if he had been poured from shadow rather than sunlight. Tall, broad shoulders under a tired black duster, hat brim dragged low as a curtain. No leer, no grin, just a jaw cut from something that did not bend, and a stillness that made noise ashamed of itself. He did not watch the auctioneer. He watched her, as one watches a ledge give way under a climber, and measures the distance to the ground. Serafina's knees threatened to spill. She summoned her old tutor's voice, the one that had taught her Latin declensions and how not to cry when corrected. Straighten the spine, the rest will follow. She did, and the rope burned like agreement with a devil. 70, shouted a man whose breath could sour milk. 80, from a boy, beard with a pearl-handled knife and a smile that practiced cruelty, the way pianists practice scales. A miner with caved-in cheeks called out a joke about breaking a woman in like a skittish mare. The laugh that followed was a falling stare. She was letting go. Not of herself, she would not give them that, but of the story that used to hold her together. The one where choices were doors and not traps, where music out, argued noise, where you could leave one life and set another carefully on your lap like a folded shawl. The wind changed. You could taste copper on it. Turn around, little lady, the auctioneer ordered, fat hands swinging as if to rotate a mannequin. The word lady struck like a cruel compliment. Serafina stared past him, past the lot of them, into the line of darkness under the brim of the quiet man's hat. She found, to her astonishment, not pity, not hunger, not even anger, She found fatigue an honorable kind, like a soldier who has lifted and carried so much he recognizes weight by eye and knows what will crush a more fragile back. 90. The auction is over, said a voice that did not raise itself and did not need to. Silence arrived the way thunder does late, but it owns the last word. Heads turned. The quiet figure separated from the crowd, boots knocking the same rhythm as a gallows lever in men's imaginations. His hand rested on a colt, like a handshake he preferred not to offer. Dust peeled away from him, as though the town had tried to stick and fail. Thorne, the auctioneer managed, tongue newly clumsy. This ain't your business. Elias Thorne, Blackwood's sheriff by election, its conscience by stubbornness, tipped his hat just enough to let the storm sky of his eyes be seen. They were not theatrical. They were the work of years, gray as desert rain, and they did not blink. It is the law's business, he said, and the law's mine. Gambling debt is not collectible against a man's wife nor her body. You know that, Silas. There was a ripple, then one of those small, mean thrills, crowds, love when power meets power. You could feel the town lean forward. The auctioneer's real name was Silas Pike, but Blackwood called him the Jackal, for reasons that required no poetry. He wore a decent coat over indecent habits, and kept his ledger like a pastor keeps a Bible. Dog, eared with use and stained with other people's prayers. The law, Silas sneered, is what keeps my money mine. The law, Elias corrected mildly, keeps people. He stepped up onto the plank platform. The boards trembled. He did not look at Seraphina first. That might have been cruelty in its own right, to haul her up the ladder of a stranger's eyes, so he set his attention on the knot at her wrists. He did not hurry. His fingers were nicked and scarred, and they worked with the compressed patience of a blacksmith. The rope gave way with a small gasp. Pins and needles' pain slammed back into her hands. She reeled and would have gone knees first to the wood if an arm had not found the hollow of her back and steadied her with the same unremarkable competence you use to right a tipped chair. The girl goes free, he said, not to Silas, who understood only arithmetic, but to the town. Announcing a boundary is an act of education. Silas produced his ledger like a conjurer reveals a rabbit. $50,000, he said, swelling. You got that in the pocket of your little preacher's coat, Sheriff? The number moved across Seraphina's mind with the unreality of a foreign language. 50,000. Her husband had owed the horizon. Elias glanced at the ledger, then at her, and for a heartbeat the gray of his eyes thawed to something she could not name without embarrassing herself. He reached inside his duster and drew out a leather poke, heavy enough that the platform said so under his boots when he set it down. The clatter of gold coin is not a sound, it's a verdict. I'll settle the debt, he said. I'll purchase the ledger. He spoke the second sentence carefully, like a man stepping where boards might hide rot. I don't buy people. A hush sank so quickly the wind stubbed its toe on it. Even the dogs in the alley forgot their argument. Silas's face curdled. I don't sell books, Thorne. I sell satisfaction. 0. You sell leverage, Elias replied, and tapped the ledger with a finger that had broken someone's nose years ago and healed crooked. Now it's mine. Take the coin. The sheriff's office will hold this book as evidence pending investigation. Invest, Silas choked. You want to sift my dealings? That book's private property, which you have attempted to use as public noose, Elias said. So now it's evidence. Choose, Silas. Charge me with theft, or take the money and call the debt cleared. The edge of his mouth tilted, not a smile so much as an acknowledgement that chess has rules. I recommend the money. The crowd felt the shift, that invisible tilt when a bully realizes the floor is greased. Even the boy with the pretty knife ceased to fondle its handle. Seraphina breathed for the first time since dawn in a way that reached all the way down. Silas calculated like a man counting cards and remembering too late that some games have jokers. 50,000 in coin set a glitter in his eyes that devotion could not. He snatched the poke, weighed it, and hated himself for loving gravity. We're not finished, he muttered, but it sounded like a man telling a mirror he's handsomer than it says. Elias gathered the ledger. He did not tuck it away as a trophy. He held it like proof that words could still be trusted to mean what they wrote. Then, at last, he looked full at Seraphina. The look had no romance in it. which made it kinder. "Can you stand?" he asked. She nodded because speech would have tattled on her shaking. He offered his hand, not the crook of his arm, which assumes a claim, not his palm up like a supplicant, simply a square, warm hand, work, hardened and clean. She took it. Heat traveled up her forearm and braided itself into the sinew of her spine. He helped her from the platform as if the ground were a staircase, and he knew every delicate rise. The crowd opened. Shame is susceptible to example. A few men removed hats. One woman, a laundry girl with raw knuckles, set her jaw and stared at Silas until his gaze jumped away as if burned. On the edge of the boardwalk, Elias paused. He set his body between Serafina and the town the way a man sets himself between flame and a powder keg. Only then did he raise his voice, not a shout, but enough to carry to the far awnings. "No woman in Blackwood will be bought to balance a man's book," he said. "Those days are done. If you find yourself tempted, remember there's a badge in this town that bites." A few cheers tried to be born and thought better of it. Silas glared like a scorpion. The vulture's roost returned to pretending it had never seen anything at all. They crossed the street. Elias steered her into the shade beside the sheriff's office, where the air was 20 degrees kinder. Up close, the details of him broke their cover, lines at the eyes that grief had stitched, a white seam of a scar through one eyebrow like punctuation on an unfinished sentence. The soap-clean smell of a man who believed in doing simple things thoroughly. He removed a small canteen from his belt and pressed it into her hands. "Slow," he said. Water reintroduced itself to her throat, as if to a room it had once been asked to leave. She swallowed carefully and swayed again. He rested a hand not quite touching an inch from her elbow, the way one lifts a lamp near a fragile painting so the heat won't do damage. "Sheriff," she managed, finding her voice like a dropped pin in dust. "Why?" Elias looked at the street rather than her, because some answers are easier when you speak them to distance. Because debt collects fast enough in a hard country. We don't need to pay it with our souls. "That ledger," she said, the second word almost breaking on her teeth. "My husband. There are names in it." "I expect so," he replied. "His," she forced it out. "His were not all his own debts. He carried others. For men who promised to pay him back and did not. For games he swore he would win next time. For," she swallowed, "for Mr. Thorne." "Silas," Elias said, and the name wore a scowl even in his mouth. "He'll have half the territory in those pages, if I'm any judge." "He will come for it," she whispered. "For the book. For me. Elias considered that, and a slow iron settled in his face. "He'll find the book under a lawman's lock," he said. "As for you, you're not his to find. You're your own, and for the moment, under my protection." He said it with the plainness of a man who has nothing to sell. She felt something unfamiliar then, almost indecently sweet, dignity returning like circulation to a numbed limb. It hurt, it warmed, it made her want to weep, which she refused to do in public for the benefit of men who would count tears like money. He opened the office door. Inside was order, a clean desk scarred by honest work, a map of the territory annotated in a square hand, a rifle on hooks above a modest fireplace gone cold for summer. A narrow cot hid in the back room like a confession. He snagged a clean rag off a peg and set it on the desk beside a tin of salve. "Sit," he said, and for the first time all day a command did not feel like theft. Saturday, he cut the last length of rope from her wrist with a small knife that had known apples and twine and a coyote snare. He dabbed the salve with a caution that suggested he'd patched his own skin more times than he liked. "You'll need a place for the night," he said, wrapping her wrists not too tight, not proud to show his competency. "I can pay." She stopped. The lie was too tired to stand. "I cannot pay." "No." "You can keep your courage," he said, and there was a humorless twist to it that might one day grow into a smile if watered. "That spends farther than coin in my books." He nodded toward a narrow cupboard. "There's a blanket and a spare shirt if you want to be rid of that dress till we can get it washed. There's stew at Ma Royce's boarding house when your stomach forgives the morning." "You expect nothing?" The words escaped and embarrassed her, but a life among men had taught a grammar. Gifts conjugated to obligations. Elias lifted the ledger. "I expect we'll read this," he said. Names, sums, the shape of Blackwood's rot. If there's daylight to be found, we'll find it. And, he looked at her then, squarely. I expect you'll tell me what you know, when you're ready. Not before. Why do you care, she asked, and it wasn't a challenge so much as a map she needed. He set the book down, hand flat on its cover as if steadying a frightened animal. Because I've seen drowning, he said, and because the law is a poor, thin thing unless it chooses a side. Mine chooses yours. Outside, the town exhaled and remembered it had errands. Boots crossed boards. A piano in the roost fumbled its way toward a tune. In the slow quiet that followed, Serafina felt the day's weight lift in increments, rather than all at once, like a dress with too many buttons. Serafina Vance, she said, offering her name as one offers a coin you hope will be accepted as legal tender. Elias Thorne, he returned, as if the town did not already know it. You're safe here. He meant the room. He might have meant the town, too, if hope had any say. Safety, she discovered, did not feel like a fortress. It felt like a man who made careful knots undo them with equal care, like salve cooling a burn, like being asked for truth and given time to find it. She looked at the ledger on his desk, the small black heart of Blackwood, and felt the first hot edge of anger she had allowed herself in months, anger that stood up straight, anger with a vow. When the sun slid and the shadows lengthened, Elias fetched his hat. I'll walk you to Ma Royce's, he said. You can eat. We'll figure the rest tomorrow. Sheriff? She said, swallowing the formality that put distance where she wasn't sure she wanted it. Elias? He lifted his chin. Thank you, she said. It wasn't enough, and it was all there was, so she made it clean. He tipped 2 fingers from the brim and held the door. On the street, the wind had changed again. It carried the faintest lick of rain from far off in the mountains, and Blackwood turned its long, starved face toward it, the way parched cattle lift their heads when they hear water. Silas Pike glared from the vulture's roost, with narrowed eyes that promised mischief dressed as law. Serafina saw him, saw the moving shadow behind his teeth, and did not look away. Elias matched her stride to stride. You don't have to be brave yet, he said without looking at her. I already am, she answered, surprised to find that the words belonged to her mouth, and to mean them. They walked into the boarding house lantern glow. Behind them, the town's wound breathed. Ahead, the stew steamed. Between those two hung a small, stubborn banner called Tomorrow. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The silence of Elias Thorne's cabin was as profound as the silence of the Arizona desert at midnight. It was the kind of quiet that made a person hear their own heartbeat, the faint tick of the clock on the mantel, the soft rasp of their own breath. On her first night in that cabin, Serafina Vance learned the contours of a new silence, one that did not threaten to swallow her, but offered space to breathe. Elias had said very few words on the ride from Blackwood. He'd handed her a canteen the way a man offers a lifeline, without ceremony. The canyon wind had a way of stealing conversation, and maybe that was why their ride passed with nothing but the creak of leather and the hush of hooves over red dirt. Yet when the cabin door closed behind them, and he set a basin and a clean towel on the table, she felt the strangest conviction that she'd stepped inside the walls of a promise. Wash, he said gently, as though the word itself could rinse away a day's worth of humiliation. She did, fingers trembling as she worked the rag across dust-streaked skin. The water turned the color of weak coffee. On the hearth, kindling caught, and the room shifted from shadow to amber. He moved with a soldier's economy, every act unadorned and precise. Fire, kettle, lamp. He placed a tin mug within reach, and stepped back as though proximity itself might bruise her. You're safe here, he said. A vow should have sounded like thunder. From him it came like weather, inevitable. She studied the lines at his eyes, the pale seam of a half-forgotten scar splitting his brow. He was older than she by some years, but what weighed him wasn't age, it was the kind of gravity that collects in a man who has stood between chaos and the helpless. Why, she asked, voice raw. Why interfere? He didn't answer right away. Firelight sketched planes over his face. Because I've watched too many drown in a crowd that called itself a town. A humorless tilt touched his mouth. And because the law here lives or dies by the hand that carries it. She swallowed. You bought the debt. I bought a ledger, he corrected. I won't own a person. There it was again, that cleaving of meaning. He could have said freedom in 24 righteous ways. Instead, he spoke like a surveyor, staking clear lines, naming what was and what wasn't. It steadied her in a way pity never could. She reached into her travel dress, into the stitched pocket that she'd guarded like a vein, and drew out the small leather book. Even in the dim light, its edges gleamed with oil and handling. This ledger, she said, chest tight. It's not mine. It's what he made of me, Thomas. The syllables tasted of ash. She placed the book on the table with the careful loathing of someone setting down a snake. Elias didn't open it. He waited in his palm, the muscles in his forearm shifting like quiet machinery, then set it high above the hearth. It will wait, he said. Eat first. He ladled stew from a blackened pot and slid a plate toward her. The meat was tough, the broth thin, but hunger translated even humble fare into something like grace. He ate standing, as if the chair had not yet earned his trust. Only once did his glance flick to the window, a reflex more than a thought. She recognized it. People who had lived with danger didn't study their fear. They studied their exits. Tomorrow, he said, I'll ride into town. Folks will be looking for a story. I'll give them one that keeps our doors from being tested. Our, she echoed, tasting the word with mingled hope and alarm. He heard both. You can leave when you wish, he spoke without ceremony again. Until then, my roof, my word. The fire cracked, scattering embers like red stars. She had nothing left that could be called faith, and yet his plainness coaxed something that resembled it. Thank you, she managed. He inclined his head, already turning away to stoke the fire. You should sleep. She woke to a smell she had not known she could miss. Coffee, the real kind, not the brackish familiarity of saloon dregs. Dawn pushed pale light through the curtains. Outside, a windmill creaked like an old hymn. Elias's boots crossed the floorboards with their careful, even cadence. He set a cup within reach and a folded square of cloth beside it. Bandage, he said, nodding at her wrists. Only then did she see the rope burn swelling dusky on her skin. She lifted one hand, embarrassed by the tremor. He didn't reach to touch her. He only turned slightly, providing the illusion of privacy while still keeping sentry. The simple courtesy undid her in a way grand gestures never could. She wrapped the cloth herself, biting the inside of her cheek when the sting rose to her eyes. Will they come? She asked. For you? A muscle feathered at his jaw. For the book. Silas Thorne, she said, tasting the venom in the name. They call him the Jackal. They call him what they need him to be, Elias replied. Predators grow larger in the telling. They also die. She looked up sharply. He was not braggadocious. There was no swagger in him, but something flint-like lived behind his gray eyes, and it struck sparks against any mention of the man who had tried to convert her life into columns and sum. He shrugged into his duster, buckled his gun belt, checked the chamber with the quiet ritual of habit. Lock the door when I leave. Only open to my knock. 3 and 1. He rapped knuckles against the wood, 3 quick, 1 slow. If anyone asks, you tell them you're under the protection of the law. If they ask whose law, you tell them mine. She almost smiled. That may not make the answer easier to hear. It makes it louder, he said, and left. She listened to his horse's hooves diminish along the washboard road until the cabin felt like its own small island again. She stood, stretched her hands toward the warmth, and surveyed the room with the domestic urgency of someone who needs work like medicine. The place was tidy, but a man's tidy, clean lines, bare surfaces, function laid out like tools. She liked that. She could add gentleness without fighting clutter. She scrubbed the table and the hearthrug, boiled the kettle and scoured the tin plates with sand, shook dust from the braided rug, opened the window to draw a corridor of air through the room. She found a cast-iron skillet so well seasoned it shone and a blue crock of flour with grit in the rim. She sifted and hummed something that might have been a hymnal once, then caught herself and went quiet. irritated at the fragility of the sound. On a shelf she discovered a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius, a Bible with an uncreased spine, and unexpectedly a slim book of Beethoven transcriptions for parlor piano. She touched the latter with reverence and absurdity. There was no piano within 100 miles, and yet the sight of the treble clef was like water. By the time the sun stood overhead like an onlooker, the cabin glowed with a lived-in order. She had set dough to rise beside the hearth, chopped onion and dried peppers for the pot, and washed the last of the dust from her hair. She braided it without ceremony, the way a woman does when intending to work. Elias returned near dusk with the wind on his coat and sand in the stubble of his cheeks. A thread of blood darkened his cuff. Her breath hitched. "You're hurt." "Not mina." He peeled back the sleeve to show the smear belonged to someone else. Had to step between a bottle and a boy who thought he wanted to be a man. She exhaled, anger and relief warring in the furnace of her chest. And the bottle lost. He set a small parcel on the table. "For your hands, comfrey and pine pitch. Mrs. O'Rourke at the Mercantile swears by it. I swore less in return." "You shouldn't have." She reached for the parcel anyway, half awkward in her gratitude. "Couldn't help it." A tired ghost of humor passed across his face. "And I gave the town what it wanted." She frowned. "Which is a story that costs them nothing." He poured water, drank hard, then met her gaze. "You're a witness under my protection. That ledger is evidence in an ongoing investigation." "An investigation?" Her heart quickened. "But you," he raised a hand. "Words make a frame even when the painting isn't finished. The bankers hear investigation and tuck their necks. The drifters hear evidence and drift. Silas hears under my protection and decides whether he wants a war. Do you?" Her voice was quieter than she intended. "No." He sank into the chair finally, as if gravity had called in its debt. "But I'll have one if he insists." She set stew and bread before him and watched the lines ease, one by one, as hunger did its quiet miracles. He told her what he'd seen, the way gossip outruns truth, the way fear turns men into statistics in their own ledgers, the way a town can begin to hope again if someone stands where a sheriff ought to stand. When he fell silent, she went to the shelf above the hearth. The ledger waited like a loaded question. She did not touch it. "I married a man who promised the arithmetic would favor us," she said, voice steadying on each word. "Instead, it devoured us." Elias leaned back, the chair complaining low under him. What did he want from Silas? Credit. Favor. A place at a table where men speak in low voices and the whiskey is free. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold. He said it was temporary. He said he'd make it right. He said so many things that sounded like a future. "And when the future came due," Elias said softly, "he paid with you." She stared into the fire until sparks became a geography. "I thought leaving the East would make me new, but I brought the same person with me." "The choosing kind?" he asked. "The believing kind," she said. "And belief is a currency out here. Everyone wants to buy it." He said nothing for a long moment. When his voice came, it had something of gravel and something of mercy in it. Belief isn't the enemy. Selling it is. On the second morning, he woke her before sunrise, not with words but with coffee and a bundle of old clothes. "For chores," he said, a hint of apology in the way he didn't meet her eye. "There's a garden that needs saving and a pump that sulks." "I know the type," she said lightly, and his mouth quirked as if against his will. He showed her the narrow rectangle of earth behind the cabin, its furrows scabbed with hardpan. Weeds offered a hopeful republic. The pump did sulk, squealing at every stroke like something theatrical. She set her back to both with a fervor that startled her. Sweat stung the rope burns. Dirt found its old, rightful home under her nails. When the first angry clods fell apart into something like soil, she felt an indecent triumph. The work clarified her in a way no statement of purpose ever had. Elias mended a rail, sharpened two tools, unsnarled a coil of baling wire that had a philosophical objection to linear time. They worked side by side, in a quiet that felt less like absence, and more like a hymn sung by two people who know the same tune but not the same words. At noon he paused, thumb pressed to the bridge of his nose against the headache that sun and duty conspire to make. "We need allies," he said. "Not men who owe me favors, men who owe justice something." "Who?" "A blacksmith named Hoka. Fought iron with his father long before we took the territory from him in ink and rifles. He remembers what it costs a place to forget its own law. And the others?" She sank onto the stoop, pleasure and fatigue making diplomacy with each other in her bones. "Jedediah Lane. Vet. Took a bullet at Shiloh and a wife out of a cholera camp. Makes him efficient and unwilling to waste anything, including women's lives." He took a drink, the canteen's dented side glinting. "And Mary O'Rourke, who knows the ledgers of this town better than any banker, because she keeps the ones that matter: who owes flour, who owes birth, who owes digging a grave." "You think they'll stand?" "If I ask," he said, "but I won't ask until I can put names to numbers." His gaze cut toward the hearth where the ledger waited like a dare. "Tonight." She nodded, stomach tightening in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. The book felt animate, something that recorded not just transactions but crosses made over people's bodies. Afternoons slid over them, heavy with heat and small victories. A length of fence stood straighter, a row of beans shed its martyrdom and decided to live. The pump gave up a blessing of water at last with a gush that sent them both laughing like conspirators. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist and felt, for a heartbeat, the child she had been mud-cheeked, proud of a crooked fort built behind her father's workshop. "You were a girl who made things," Elias said, watching her. She blinked. "How did you know?" "You tidy by arranging," he said quietly. "It's how you fight chaos. You put a border on it." The observation struck like intimacy. She coughed it away with a laugh. "And you?" "I was a boy who watched the door." His mouth tipped wry. "My father drank. I learned to hear a problem by how it crossed a threshold." She winced at the picture, uninvited pity buzzing, and he sensed it. "He tried," Elias added evenly. "Sometimes trying is an entire man's life. Sometimes it's a woman's too," she said, thinking of Thomas, of the way a hand can learn the shape of apology and forget the shape of accountability. As the sun leaned west, they took their supper on the stoop. Coyotes stitched their ragged hymn across the flats. A string of distant riders made punctuation marks against the horizon, then dissolved into heat shimmer. Elias watched the line too long to be casual. "Miners," he said finally. "Not Silas's men. They ride slumped. Vices weigh more than rifles." She forced a breath out. "You have a way of making even dread sound like geography." "That's all dread is," he said. "A map of where you won't go." "Zo." They opened the ledger when the room had gone full amber, and the clock had given up measuring anything but the persistence of time. Elias brought it down as a priest brings down a reliquary and laid it on the table between them. He did not take the chair opposite. He took the one beside her, shoulder a respectful span away, as if to say, "If it bites, we'll bleed together." He glanced at her hands. "You ready?" "No," she said honestly. "Do it anyway." He cracked the spine. The scent came up of old leather and men's breath. Ink lines marched like small tyrants, the tidy terror of accounts kept by a patient predator. Names appeared in neat ledger script. Willie Garner loan, $12. M. Kavanaugh advance for claim, $60. Sheriff's discretionary, $200. Elias's fingers stilled. He didn't flinch, but something colder than anger slid into his gaze. "He bought a sheriff," he said simply, and the words landed with less surprise than inevitability. "How?" she whispered. "The last man," he said, not as a title but as a diagnosis. "Before I came." His mouth tightened. "Silas paid the badge to look away. To sign warrants he shouldn't. To open cells he shouldn't. The town didn't have law. It had a receipt." He turned pages. More names. The patterns began to declare themselves the way constellations do once someone points. Men who drank more started owing more. Men with daughters owed fastest. Property shifted on the whisper of a signature. The same 5 men witnessed everything, like acolytes executing a liturgy. "Here," Elias said, tapping a corner where ink turned faint under a smear. "This is a hand that didn't want to write the words it was writing." "How do you know?" He gave her a sidelong look. "Because I've written reports like that." They worked through the book the way 2 people clear a collapse, passing entries between them, naming what they found, resting only long enough to breathe. then lifting again. Once, when a familiar name rose up like a drowned face, she caught her breath. "Mary Lou Gall," she said. "Widow, 2 toddlers. Thomas said her husband ran off." She closed her eyes. He didn't run. She pointed. He owed. Elias's jaw clicked. "We fix what we can," he said. It sounded like a vow he had been saying granule by granule for years, as if a man could move a mountain by sheer repetition. They found entries that roped into something bigger, timelines that matched disappearances, credit that became collateral, that became flesh. Elias wrote in a little pocket notebook as they went, his script surprisingly careful for a man who looked carved from quarried stone. Finally, he closed the book, palm resting on it like a benediction withheld. "That's enough for tonight." She nodded, mouth dry, eyes burning with letters. "I used to think books saved people." "They do," he said. "This one just hasn't learned how yet." He rose, returned the ledger to its shelf, and turned down the lamp until the room tucked them into a pocket of shadow. When he crossed to the window, she knew without asking. He was counting stars that were actually men's campfires. "How many?" she asked. "Too many to be harmless," he said. "Too few to be stupid." She found herself smiling despite the coil of fear. "You speak in parables." "I speak in weather," he corrected. "The barometer falls before the storm." At dawn, the desert put on its limestone blue and gold. Elias saddled his horse with the economy that had already begun to seem like a kind of courtesy to her. Nothing wasted, everything meant. "I'll see Hoka," he said. "If he says yes, the iron in this town will sing to my tune for a while. And I want Jed to see where my bullets went last year and tell me if he thinks they'll go there again." "There." "What about Mary O'Rourke?" "She'll come when she's ready," he said with the unfeigned respect men rarely offer easily. "She's the only person who can make a mob into a congregation." He hesitated. "I'd rather you stay in." She lifted her chin. "I'd rather many things." That made him huff something like a laugh. 3 and 1, he repeated at the door. "Not 2 and 2, not 2 in a panicked tree." "I'll practice." He was gone a heartbeat later, a dark line moving into brighter lines. She turned to the work she could do and did it with a fervor that felt nearly holy. Mending a torn shirt with small, ruthless stitches, scrubbing a pan until it held a dull reflection, writing down the names from last night's parade and underlining the ones that belonged to women. She set aside 2 loaves from the oven's morning heat and wrapped them in a towel that had belonged to no one she knew until today, when it became hers because she needed it to be. A shadow passed the front window around mid-morning, not tall enough for Elias. Her stomach snapped tight. The knock came a second later, 3 quick, 1 slow. She exhaled, dizzy with relief, just as a voice drawled from the porch, lazy as dust. "Darlin', a man gets tired of knocking polite when the person inside don't know friendly from fearful." She went very still. The voice did not belong to Elias. It carried the sing-song menace of someone who wanted to be feared for his wit more than his gun. "You got the wrong door," she called, forcing steadiness into her tone. "That's the right ledger, though," the voice said cheerfully. "We hear you got yourself promoted from property to librarian," a chuckle that didn't reach his lungs. "Silas is sentimental about his books." Something scratched the door, a fingernail, or a knife tip. She set the rifle's stock into the pocket of her shoulder and found the window's edge with her peripheral vision. "You should leave," she said, softly and clearly. "You're trespassing under the protection of Sheriff Elias Thorne." Silence, then a spitting sound and a muttered curse. Boots shuffled back. She pictured 2 men, maybe 3. The way you can feel weight arranges itself on the earth outside your door. A minute stretched. The shadow moved away. Her knees went weak only after they were gone. She sank to the chair and pressed her forehead to her wrapped wrists until the little pulse at each temple made its case for continuing. When Elias returned mid-afternoon, the story came out in efficient parcels. He listened with his whole face, a rare thing in any man. 2, he said, confirming her count. 3 would have left a smell. 2 watched their own fear too closely to hide it. He rubbed a thumb along his jawline where stubble rasped like a file. "Hoka's in, Jed's in, Mary's in if I bring her names that make her church breathe like a lung." He nodded at the shelf. "We'll give her a full set." "And Silas?" Elias's mouth thinned. He's not a man who visits personally unless he intends to be seen. He'll send men who fold quick. He plays long games from short chairs. That night, they worked the book again. She found more than accounting now. She found patterns of intent. The ink had a voice. Sometimes it bragged. Sometimes it trembled. Sometimes it lied. At one entry, her breath seized. Elias, she said, finger hovering over a name. The previous sheriff. He read the line, the sum, the note scribbled in the margin, ink blotted as if a hand had fumbled. Disbursement upon resignation, he recited flatly. They paid him to leave. She looked up. And you came after. End of. I came because there was a gap, he said simply. Men like Silas crawl into gaps. And men like you. Put a boot in them, he said. And his half-smile did not reach his eyes. On the fourth day, the wind swung north and brought with it a clean blade of cold that set the cottonwoods hissing. Elias walked the perimeter of the property like a man calibrating a map to a compass. When he came in, he carried a coil of barbed wire, and the news that wire was about to matter. Silas put men at the ford, he said. Not to stop me, to count me. Count? He wants to know if I'm alone. He glanced at her, a flicker of grim humor warming the gray. He's bad at math. We need more numbers, she said, surprising herself with the way the pronoun came natural now. We need more courage, he said. The numbers will come if the courage stands first. How do you teach a town to be brave? You don't, he said. You let it remember. Oh. He left again at dusk, the ledger-copied entries tucked into his pocket notebook, riding against his thigh like a second holster. She watched him go, and told herself she was only counting the minutes to anticipate his needs, not because the minutes had suddenly become living things that paced when he was gone. He returned late, lamplight catching silver at his temples. She had not noticed until that moment. Fatigue brought him closer to the truth of himself. It spared him the work of deflection. He set down a paper-wrapped parcel and a folded handbill. What's this? She asked. Proof, he said. And bait. She unfolded the handbill. The words were stark and indecorous. Town meeting. Charges to be read. Witnesses called. Bring your fear and see if it can stand in a room with its name on a page. You printed this? She asked, startled. I made Mary write it, he said, deadpan, so people would come. And the proof? He unwrapped the parcel. Inside lay a medallion on a broken chain worn smooth with handling, the relief nearly erased by thumb and time. From Jed, he said, belonged to a man who signed 3 of Silas's ugliest notes. The man left town with a bullet in his back and this in his pocket. She touched the metal. What does it mean? That men who help monsters sometimes leave a piece of themselves behind when they run, he said. Sometimes we get to make that piece testify. The meeting was set for 2 nights hence. Between then and now, they reinforced the cabin in subtle ways, the way one braces themselves without hoping to be tested. Elias shifted the table to create a better angle of fire if it came to that, then scolded himself for teaching blood to expect itself. She moved the lamp to the floor when they read the ledger, so the window wouldn't show 2 bright targets to men who preferred shooting light to shooting truth. On the day between, Mary O'Rourke came. She did not knock. She pushed the door with the authority of a woman who had brought 3 men into this world and buried one. Her hair was red where it escaped a practical knot, and her eyes took the room in like inventory. So, she said, you're the girl. It was not unkind. It was accurate. I'm the woman, Seraphina said, surprising herself with the steadiness of it. Mary's mouth twitched. We'll see. She held out a hand. Mary. Seraphina. Too many syllables for a place this thirsty, Mary said. We'll keep them safe. She glanced at Elias. You got me names? He handed her the notebook, open to a page hedged with furious neatness. She read like a blacksmith testing for soundness as much as meaning. Once, she snorted. Once, she swallowed hard. We can make a town out of this, she said finally. Or a graveyard. Either way, it'll be honest. Honest will do, Elias said. Mary's gaze slid to Seraphina's wrists. You'll testify. Seraphina heard her heartbeat once in each palm. Yes, Mary nodded. We'll need women in the room. Men are dangerous when they think they're the only witnesses. She turned to go, then paused. "Wear something that reminds you who you are," she said to Seraphina, "and bring bread. Men listen better when they've chewed." When she was gone, Seraphina leaned against the table and laughed. "Is she the governor?" "She was," Elias said, "until they invented the word." The afternoon before the meeting, a dust devil danced the length of Main Street as if the town needed a fool to show it where the wind wanted to go. Elias and Seraphina walked there anyway, because fear gets fat when fed in private. Men watched with faces like shutters, some cracked open, some nailed shut, some rattling on rusted hinges. Women watched with faces like plates meant for service, chipped by use, beautiful in their honest wear. Children watched like feral cats and saints. Hoka's forge breathed like a beast. He came out with heat in his beard and iron dust stippling his arms. "You'll need more nails," he said to Elias, "and a horseshoe for luck." He winked at Seraphina, "The kind that fits in a pocket." He pressed a small, flattened charm into her palm. It was ugly and perfect. At the mercantile, Mary slapped handbills on the counter with a rhythm that turned customers into citizens. "7 o'clock, she said to anyone who pretended not to look. "Bring your name and be prepared to sign it to something that isn't a debt." Back outside, Seraphina felt a presence at her shoulder and turned to find a girl 16 at most, hair braided to war, cheeks salted with freckles. The girl's eyes were brown and furious. "You the one who made him mad?" she whispered. "I'm one of many," Seraphina said. The girl looked at Elias, then back at Seraphina. "I'm Ruth. If he comes for you, he'll have to pass me." She showed a knife sheathed in her boot, as casually as other girls show ribbons. Elias grunted. "You tell your mother I said you keep that for hogs and fools, Ruth." "That my mother says I keep it for men who think I'm property," Ruth said sweetly, and flounced away before anyone could bless or scold her. "God help us," Elias muttered. "He already is," Seraphina said, surprising herself. They returned to the cabin as the sun bled out along the ridge. She baked 4 loaves and set aside 2 for Mary's table and 2 for the meeting. Elias oiled the Winchester and cleaned the Colt with motions that were patient and grim and tender, like a man washing a child who'd been lost and found again. "Do you ever tire of carrying it?" she asked, nodding at the gun. "Every day," he said without hesitation. "But I tire of burying people more." She couldn't argue with the arithmetic of that. Night came on like a closed fist. A coyote on the ridge yipped, then shut up fast. Elias stood. She stood with him. No words. The knock when it came was not 3 and 1. It was a scrape, a probe, a whisper of metal testing wood. Elias tipped his head once toward the corner. She doused the lamp. He moved like shadow strapped in decision. The door held. The silence listened. The scrape did not return. Only then did she realize she was counting his breathing to count her own. He heard it and handed her the small, ugly charm Hoka had given. "For luck," he said. "For courage," she corrected, closing her fist around the iron until it bit. The meeting would come with its own storm, that much even the dumb air knew. For now, they slept in shifts, the night carved into watch and wait. At dawn, Elias saddled his horse for a ride that was nothing and everything. To shake hands with men who wanted their knuckles left alone. To tell a widow that her husband's name would be spoken in a room at last. To ask a preacher if he remembered the difference between forgiveness and permission. When he swung into the saddle, he looked down at her with that weary, unembarrassed candor that had become its own kind of intimacy. "If I'm late," he said, "you lock the door, and do not open it for anything without a voice attached." "What if the voice lies?" she asked. "It will," he said. "Truth has better things to do than visit at noon." His mouth tilted. "But you know the sound of mine now." "I do." He hesitated, then reached as if to touch her shoulder, thought better, and tipped his hat instead. Some boundaries are the only things that keep a person inside their own skin. He rode out. She watched until he became a heat shimmer and then a belief. And then she didn't watch at all because there was bread to cool and a dress to shake out and a set of words to choose. She wrote them small and plain on a scrap from Mary's handbill. "My name is Seraphina Vance. I am not a debt. I am not a ledger. I am not a sum you get when you divide a man by his vices." She tucked the scrap into her pocket. When the wind lifted the curtain, she let it. By late afternoon, a smear of riders had appeared on the far ridge, too far to threaten, close enough to mean. She went still, then not still, set water to boil, placed the rifle where her hands would not have to hunt for it, tore 2 loaves and wrapped them for Mary. The sky went hard and bright, the way a blade does just before it begins its work. Elias did not return by sunset. He returned by the time a woman's patience turns into a plan. The door tapped 3 and 1. She exhaled and let him in. Dust rimmed his lashes. There was a narrow cut on his cheek, the kind that tells a story later. "Well?" she asked. "Half the town will come," he said. "The other half will pretend they aren't there." He took the bread, tucked it in his saddlebag. "Hoka will stand near the door. Jed will sit where he can see who reaches for what. Mary will do the speaking we wish I could. And Silas? He'll send 2 men to sit without sitting. They'll watch to see if the room learns its own strength." He met her eyes. "So will we." The last light slid off the ridge like a coin into a pocket none of them would ever find again. He checked his pistol. She checked her breath. Together they stepped into a night that felt, for the first time in a long time, like something that might keep them if they kept each other. "Ready?" he asked. "No," she said again and smiled. "Let's go anyway." Still here? Hit the comments with a flood of 1 second, and tell us where you're watching from if you love Wild West love stories. The storm came not with thunder, but with the quiet whisper of boots on the desert floor. Serafina, who had grown accustomed to the profound silence of the Thorne ranch, heard it first. A sound that was a betrayal of the land itself. She was mending a tear in Elias's worn work shirt, a domestic task that had, over the past week, become a source of quiet comfort. Her heart, which had just begun to beat with a steady rhythm, now hammered against her ribs. She looked up, her gaze fixed on the front door. "Elias," she whispered, barely a breath. He sat at his desk, tallying neat columns for the general store salt, lamp oil, horseshoe nails, as if arithmetic could hold the world together. His gray eyes, usually so calm, sharpened like flint, struck for a spark. He had heard it too. He rose without scraping the chair. His hand found the Colt by reflex. Leather creaked like a warning. He didn't question her. He didn't need to. Her fear had weight, and it filled the room. "They've found you," he said softly. Serafina's fingers crushed the shirt fabric, her needle pricking her thumb. The little bead of blood felt indecently red. "For the ledger," she managed. "For me." "For both," he said. "Get the Winchester. Round to the back window. Stay low." She reached up for the rifle. Her palm brushed the soot-mottled stones of the hearth where the ledger, small, plain, lethal in its own way, sat on a high shelf like a coiled thing. The fire was low and breathing, a sleeping animal. She pulled the rifle free. It felt heavier than fear. Outside, coyotes had gone quiet. Even the windmill had chosen discretion and stilled. Elias moved to the front window, slid the curtain with 2 fingers, and peered into the slick ink of night. Moonlight was thin as watered milk. Shapes wavered at the cottonwoods by the creek. He counted like a metronome in his head. 5. No, 6. Maybe more in the brush to the east, where cholla stood like rows of spear points. "Positions," she whispered. 2 at the woodpile, 1 at the corral gate, 2 beyond the cottonwoods. A watcher on the rise near the old ore cart, smart one. He'll call the play. "How can you tell?" "He's not looking at the house," Elias said. "He's listening." Her mouth went dry. "What do we do?" "We make him listen to the wrong thing." He crossed to the stove, pinched the flame under the coffee to darkness, and whisked the kettle away. The cabin breathed in the shadow. He moved about it like a man who had measured the gloom. 3 steps from desk to door, 2 to the shelf where extra cartridges slept in a tin. He pressed the tin into her hands and went to the corner by the back window. "You shoot only if you know," he murmured. "No guesses." "I'm not trained." "Oat." "Neither is most of the world," he said, and there was a tenderness inside the dry humor that steadied her more than a sermon. "Breathe through your nose. Count to 3 on the exhale. Your hands will stop shaking at 4. The first shot cracked the silence into cruel glitter. Glass burst from the front window. A handful of stars turned to teeth. Serafina flinched, her body choosing honesty over bravery for one heartbeat. Then she forced herself flat, the braided rug rough against her cheek. Elias was already motion, a shadow uncoiling, hauling her by the arm to the angle of the hearth where the chimney mass made a wall. The second shot punched the doorframe. Splinters rained. Somewhere a horse snorted, offended. "Serafina," Elias's voice was low and clipped. "Eyes on the back window. If they swing around, we make them pay for the walk." Boots scuffed sand. A man outside hissed, "Hold. Wait on the word." "Whose word?" she breathed. "Silas," Elias said. "He said the name like you say a scorpion's genus. No kin to me," he added, and she felt the hard truth of it. A bottle arced from the cottonwoods, throat stuffed with rag. It shattered on the porch post, coughing fire. The pitch guttered, spit, then licked the dry wood like a cat. Elias was up with the wet blanket from the washstand, smothering in 3 savage beats. "Not burning us out," he muttered. "Not tonight." A voice rose from the darkness near the rise. "Sheriff Thorne, you have something belongs to me." Elias stepped to the edge of the extinguished light. "You got a warrant that says so, Silas?" "Don't need a warrant to collect what's mine." "You think you're the law," Elias said, almost pitying. "But you're just a man with a hole inside." Silas laughed, the sound slithering down the moonlight. "Hole or no, I've got 7 rifles, and you've got 1 woman who ain't never fired." Serafina's hand stilled on the rifle stock. The insult was intended as diagnosis, not description. She chose to fail the test. "Elias," she said, surprised at the iron in her own whisper. "I'm not porcelain." "Didn't say you were," he answered, and she understood. Silas had named her. Elias would not. Another shot, closer. A chip of adobe bit Serafina's cheek. She tasted lime and grit. She slid the Winchester to the sill and dared a glance. Movement at the granary, 2 shapes low and fast. Her breath tried to gallop. She forced it into a plodding mule's pace. 1, 2, 3. On 4, her sights found the darker fold in the dark. A hat brim, a sliver of cheek. She squeezed. The recoil punched her shoulder like a drunk friend. A shape stumbled. She didn't see him fall. She dropped straight down as a return shot chewed the window frame where her eye had been. Elias barked once from the front flank. Someone cursed out by the woodpile, then went quiet in the grass. The house shook with another impact, this one low. The door latch juddered, and Serafina smelled raw pine. "Breach," Elias said, and his voice was more arithmetic than panic. He crossed in a crouch, slid the heavy cedar chest, the one with his war coat folded inside against the door. Another ram hit. The hinges whined, then held. "Third hit will crack," Elias said. "On 3, we give them the way they think they want." "What?" "Open and take their legs." Her mouth tightened. "Tell me where you want me." "Back window. Give them noise right as I move. 2 shots, fast. Make them duck." She nodded. The nod felt like the first oath she had ever sworn purely to herself. He counted with his fingers, not in words, and when he curled the last digit down, Serafina popped up and fired twice, not aimed to kill, but aimed to speak a language with verbs like scatter and flinch. Men cursed. Elias tore the chest aside, yanked the door inward just as the ram came. The battering log overslung the threshold and dragged 2 men with it. Elias stepped into them, a sudden geometry of elbow, boot, and the gun barrel used not like a tool but like a hinge of physics. The first man's shin met the door edge with a crack. The second man's face met the jam. Neither argument was persuasive to bone. Both fell. The night yowled. More shots, wild and wide now that the neat plan had become a pile of limbs. A muzzle flared at the cottonwoods. Elias fired into the light. The light went out like truth in a saloon. "Back!" he snapped, and Serafina crabbed from the sill as buckshot plowed little furrows across the plaster where her head had just been. She rolled, came up against the table, and her knee hit something that made a small metallic thud, the ledger's clasp key lying where earlier she had set it after dusting. She snatched it without thinking and slid it into the pocket sewn inside her skirt with tremoring fingers. The room smelled like Smoke's older cousin, cordite. Outside, Silas's voice cut again, colder. Thorne. I can pay another half-dozen men. I'll keep coming. Hand over the book and the girl, and I'll spare your lawman pride. You got 5 seconds to choose which coffin. Elias answered by not answering. Silence can be the most arrogant word in the language. Suit yourself, Silas said. The sound of boots shifted the rhythm of a group recordoning. They meant to circle and pour the house full of bullets like a canteen into a dry throat. Never mind who drowned. Chimney, Elias said in a hush. They'll try to smoke us and rake both sides. We break their line. How? We take the fight to the one who thinks he's not in it. The watcher on the rise. He nodded. Cut the head of the snake. Is that a proverb? It's surgery. Her terror bucked. She bridled it. What do you need? He gave her a long look, weighing something older than strategy. Can you run like you mean to live? She swallowed. Yes. We use the ditch by the garden. Stay on your belly in the grass till the shed shadow. I'll pull fire from the front. When you reach the mesquite, you'll have the rise edge. The watcher will have his attention on me. And if he's not alone, then you shoot first and think kindly of me later. Lev. It was lunacy of a specifically Western flavor, half courage, half math, a quarter insult to the odds. The extra quarter, she thought, must be love, though she pretended not to know that word belonged here yet. He moved to the front again, made a show of rattling the door, and called out, Silas, you always did count like a banker backwards to the truth. The taunt did its work. Rifles lifted. Men leaned in where prudence would have told them to lean out. Serafina slid to the back, lifted the latch, fed her body through the thin seam of night, and pressed herself against the adobe. The earth was cool, honest with its grit. She inhaled its mineral calm. The ditch waited, a shallow ink ribbon. She crawled. Every blade of grass felt like a drumstick. Somewhere behind her, Elias fired 2 quick notes and a slower one. His signature. Bullets stitched the air above the ditch. They tattled to the hardpan and sobbed out. The shed shadow was a sanctuary she had to earn. She reached it and lay there, forehead in dirt, counting 1 breath, 2, 3. The sweat at the base of her skull pretended to be spiders. She told it to stop. Beyond the mesquite, the ground pitched up in a lazy shoulder. The ore cart sat there like a rusted beetle that had decided to sleep for a decade. Between its wheels, a man crouched with a spyglass, not looking at the house but at the dark around the house, listening. Elias had read him right. He was a listener. He was also careful enough to keep a second rifle laid across the cart rim, ready to hand. Serafina raised the Winchester and felt the old tremble try to come back. She gave it no hospitality. She measured the distance with the eyes she used to judge the weight of books. She sighted not on his head but on the spyglass, the small metal circle that was his arrogance. She exhaled. 4. She fired. The spyglass exploded into glitter. The man flinched, grabbed at his face, and in grabbing knocked the spare rifle from the cart. He swore with a creativity that suggested a childhood near a dock. He reached for a pistol instead. Serafina had already worked the lever. The second shot took the pistol from his fingers. Skin or bone she didn't know. She knew only that he howled and fell backward into the ore cart's shadow. Hands, she said, surprised again by her own voice. Show them. He did. In the broken moonlight, his palms were pale leaves. He was young, she realized, younger than she'd thought a beard grown to argue with the fact. His left eye bled in a weeping, glittering streak where the spyglass had kissed him hard. Don't shoot, he said. Hell, lady, don't shoot. Silas ain't worth your bullet. His accent had the plains in it. What's your name? Finn, he said, as if that could be collateral. Finn what? Finn Abernathy, he said, which was either an honest answer or the first lie to come into his head. Either way, it felt like a hinge she could use. Look, he breathed, part plea, part negotiation. He promised cash. Said it was just to scare you folk. I don't, he hissed when the wind touched his eye. Then help me, she said, and the firmness in her own tone startled her. Call to your men. Tell them to fall back. Tell them the sheriff's got the book wired to a dead man, and the whole desert will read Silas by dawn if Elias's heartbeat stops. It true? Finn asked, something like admiration creeping in. You wired it? It's true enough unless you press your luck and make it false. He swallowed. His Adam's apple looked like a frightened animal. He lifted himself until his head was a shadow over the cart rim and called, "Hold! Fall back too! Silas, hold your damn horses! Thorne's got a canary that sings when he ain't breathing." Silas's answer was a single, skeptical bullet into the ore cart's flank. The clang rolled down into the arroyo, where ghosts of water remembered being water. Finn flinched and looked at Serafina with the brittle grin of someone who has just learned something unflattering about his employer. "He ain't a trusting type." "Neither am I," she said. "Lie again, and I'll put the next round through your kneecap and let the coyotes debate mercy." "Understood," he said. And in that one word there was a small, crooked respect. Down by the house, Elias used the moment of hesitation like a craftsman uses a gap in the grain. He stepped out onto the porch, low and sideways, and shot the lantern Silas's second had unwisely lifted to see better. Darkness gulped at the sudden gift, and the men's formation frayed. Elias slid back like a tide. "Finn," Serafina said. "How many left tight on the creek side?" "3," he said. "1 old, 2 stupid. Old one's named Chalmers. Shoots better than he talks. Is Silas with them?" "Silas don't low himself to creeks," Finn said, bitterness peeking out like a bone. "He stays back and makes arithmetic with other men's blood." "Then pull Chalmers," she said. "Tell him Silas wants him on the rise to spot to the south." "Oh, he'll smell that," Finn said, but he cupped his hands and called anyway. "Chalmers. On me. Silas says south watch." Chalmers's answer was exactly what Finn had predicted. "Silas can kiss my—" Serafina fired one shot into the dirt 3 inches from where Chalmers's heel must be. The bullet kicked dust into his ankle. He swore, louder now and convinced, and began to move. The other 2 shifted to cover him. For a brief instant, the creekside was a curtain drawn by clumsy actors. Elias came through that curtain like a man stepping through rain instead of bullets. He reached the cottonwood cluster at a crouch, and now he was among them, where rifles turned to clubs and bravado turns to breath. The sounds changed. Wood on bone, the grunt of lungs meeting elbows, the short, swallowed cries men make when dignity is heavier than pain. One shape broke from the cluster and ran. Elias didn't shoot him in the back. Serafina understood and hated that she admired it so much. Then came the moment that had to come. Silas's patience broke like a bad tooth. He rose from his smart distance and decided to be brave at the precise second when bravery was cheapest. He ran up the street line, his coat flapping, his pistol lively in his fist. "Thorne," he shouted, and there was a fever in the sound that made Serafina's skin go cold. "You think you can count me out of my own town?" "Not your town," Elias said from the cottonwoods. "Not while anyone can spell the word law." From Silas's pistol flared. Elias spun half dance, half physics, and dropped behind the tree trunk as bark spat. He came up to return fire, and then hissed like a stove when a hot pan is mislaid. A bullet had kissed his upper arm. Blood made a dark, slick ribbon down to his wrist. Serafina was already moving without checking in with her fear. She vaulted the ore cart, Finn yelped, then swore he wasn't moving and ran low along the rise, then slithered down the lee slope until she reached the cottonwood's shadow. She pressed against the same trunk Elias had chosen. He looked at her with equal parts fury and gratitude. "You were supposed to be in the ditch," he said. "I got promoted," she said, breathless. "Arm?" "Through and through," he lied. She ripped a strip from the hem of her petticoat, twisted it hard. "Hold still." She bound above the wound tight enough to earn a curse. "Language," she said, and the unlikeliness of the rebuke in the middle of a gunfight made his mouth twitch despite the pain. Silas was 20 paces off now, using the angle of the porch rail he had tried to burn as cover against the man he wanted dead. He fired again. The slug chewed the cottonwood and slapped the air near Serafina's ear. She tasted metal and remembered the needle prick, and some sardonic corner of her soul muttered, "Always the left side first." "Can you give me his hat?" Elias asked. She blinked. "What?" "His hat. Put a hole in it. Make him mad enough to stand up into stupidity." She did not argue the morality of hat shooting in wartime. She stood, counted to 4, and sent a round that scraped the brim from Silas's head like a barber with an aggressive razor. The hat flipped into the dust. Silas cursed with a lilt that suggested he had, once upon a time, learned his blasphemy from somebody's mother. "Now," Elias said. He stepped out as if he were simply going to cross a hallway. He fired once and took the revolver from Silas's hand, neatly, like he was plucking a weed from a garden he did not intend to abandon yet. Silas stared at his empty fist, with outrage more than fear. "Don't," Elias warned. But Silas lunged anyway, both hands for the rifle Elias had leveled. They were in that close, stupid range where weapons become like chess pieces, jammed on a board they amount to less than the wrists that hold them. Seraphina had the bad miracle of time to see it all. How the two men were identical in breadth but different in weight, one weighted by law, one by hunger. How Elias's injured arm trembled and betrayed him. How Silas saw the tremble and grin. She moved before the grin finished. She swung the Winchester like a bat and hit Silas in the collarbone with the stock. The sound was the sound of a green branch learning it is not unbreakable. Silas reeled. Elias drove his shoulder into Silas's stomach. They hit the porch boards together. The boards objected and cracked. The ledger's high place on the mantel seemed to lean nearer, like a spectator. Something slammed the side of Seraphina's skull. The butt of some other man's pistol stars filled her head like a collapsed mine, glittering. She staggered, and the world doubled. The other man raised his gun to finish the work he had begun on her consciousness. Finn's voice came from the rise, high and panicked, and bless him, loyal for at least 3 seconds. "Behind you," he shouted, not at his boss, but at the woman he had never met until tonight. Whether it was an apology or a prayer, Seraphina didn't know. She did know that the split second of warning saved her. She dropped, the shot skated over her hair, and she rolled, fired from the ground, and the man yelped and grabbed for his ankle as the bullet found something that would make stairs unpleasant for a season. Silas raked his fingernails down Elias's injured arm. Elias's face went gray with the white in the gray, a color you don't learn until you've been hurt for a long time. He headbutted Silas with the calm inevitability of a church bell. Silas's nose crunched like a beetle under a wagon wheel. Blood made a mask. "Book," Silas gasped, mouth red. "You think paper will save you? Paper burns. Men burn. I don't." "You already did," Elias said, his voice so tired it sounded like wisdom. He drove his fist up from somewhere that was not the body but borrowed it. It crashed against Silas's jaw. Lights went out behind Silas's eyes. He hung there against the rail like laundry that had changed its mind about drying. The night changed. It didn't get quieter. It got suddenly older. The remaining men, most of whom had thought themselves believers in Silas simply because he had always been standing, looked up and saw him not standing. Without the arithmetic of his orders, their sums unraveled. 2 ran into the desert, believing distance equals absolution. One threw his pistol into the dust as if to say, "That wasn't mine after all." Chalmers, limping, sat on the ground and leaned his back against the cottonwood and began to laugh until the laugh turned heaving and he put his head in his hands, and if it was weeping or just oxygen, no one called it anything. "Hold," Elias called to whoever would obey the sound of a man who had earned the order. "Guns down, hands up. Anyone moves toward that woman, he doesn't move again. End of sex." They obeyed, more relieved than afraid. Relief has better posture. Seraphina stood, dizzy with the skull's bell still ringing, and leaned one hand on the porch post. The night smelled of blood and creosote and truth. Elias swayed on his feet. She caught him by the belt, and together they made one adequate vertical person. She could feel the heat pouring off his skin through his shirt-sleeve fever's early letter. "We're not done," he murmured, the words furred. "We're done enough," she said. "For tonight." Silas groaned, rolled to his side, and spat blood. "You've ruined it," he said thickly. "All my careful," he gestured, vague and angry. "At an empire very small men build in very large lands. You think you win, Thorne? You bought yourself enemies with your gold and that woman's pretty lies." Elias looked at Seraphina. She felt the ledger key a weight against her thigh. She stepped past the splayed bodies on the porch and into the cabin. The hearth was still lit, a stubborn little Sunday. She reached up and brought the ledger down. Its leather felt like animal skin that still remembered the animal. She returned to the porch and set it on the steps, then put her foot on it, just enough pressure to say, "Not yours." "This," she said, and her voice carried in the ruined yard like water in the sluice, "is not a lie, Silas. It's a mirror. We'll let the town look." "Oh, town belongs to—" "No," Elias interrupted, and the word had a horizon in it. "It belongs to whoever can sleep in it without locking the door." Silas laughed, a thick, broken sound. "Then you'll never sleep." He tried to stand. His left leg buckled. He went back to the dust and looked surprised to be introduced to it. From the corral, a horse stamped as if the earth had just reported something unflattering. Down the road, somewhere past where the windmill had stopped and the cottonwoods began, a lamp bobbed one of the neighbors, awakened by arithmetic done too loudly. Another lamp. Soon, a third. Night has a way of telling secrets to people who have to wake early anyway. Elias sagged then, not dramatically but inexorably. His good hand found the porch post. His bad arm hung like a question. Serafina slid her shoulder under his and bore up. He was heavy, heavier than fear, but some physics allows love to be a lever even before you admit the word belongs to you. "Inside," she said. "Now." He nodded once, obedient and finally mortal. They crossed the threshold, left shoeprints of blood and creek mud on the plank floor they had scrubbed that morning. She eased him into the chair by the table. His breath came in 2 counts, one for now, one for later. She lit the lamp with 3 tries that she told herself was the wick's fault, then set out what she had: boiled water, clean rags, thread, whiskey. Her hands shook only until they didn't. When she tore his sleeve, he flinched, not with vanity but with memory. "Tell me where to start," she said. "Tourniquet's good," he managed. "Through muscle, no bone. We need to push the track clean, stitch before the town arrives to stare." He looked at her, his gaze swimming and then clearing as if the pain had scoured some fog. "You did well." "I didn't set the table for the company," she said, and the sideways smile he gave her put something back in her chest that had been taken when glass burst. She cleaned the wound. He bit down on leather that had ambitions to be called a belt. His jaw worked. When the whiskey hit the raw track, he went still with the kind of still that makes statues nervous. She stitched. Her needle dove and surfaced, left a line like a new railroad across a county nobody had mapped yet. He breathed through it with a discipline that had the war somewhere behind it, and Sarah somewhere before it. Serafina didn't know if she wanted to be jealous of the dead or grateful to be taught by them. Outside, voices collected the way creek water does after a rain. Jed's bark came first, the world-weary music of a man who has handled both cows and men past midnight. "Elias, you in one piece, you stubborn." He cut himself off when he saw the porch, Lord above. Serafina tied off the last stitch and pressed a clean pad over it. "He is," she called, and her voice carried better than she felt. "For now." Jed crossed the doorway, hat in hand, boots careful, eyes doing both the work of counting bodies and the work of counting blessings. He took in Serafina at the table, bloody apron, needle poised, hair fallen. He nodded once, deep as a bow. "Miss Vance," he said, "you got iron." "Mostly thread," she said, because something in her refused to let the world become only solemn. Behind Jed, 2 more men hovered: Deacon, who made coffins and fences with equal competence, and Hob, who could shoot and sing and made both feel like prayer. They spread without being told, like water finds low ground. Deacon to the porch, Hob to the creek bank, Jed to the door to speak for all of them. "Who's alive out there that needs a preacher or a rope?" he asked, with the bored practicality of a place that has seen both services. "Chalmers," Elias said, breathing the syllables through his teeth. "Ankle shot on the other, 1 more ran east, Finn on the rise wounded. Silas." He let the name hang like meat in a smokehouse. "Alive, for court." "Court," Jed repeated, tasting the word. "Haven't had one of those with a real defendant since before the flood that didn't come." "Lon." "Get him, Jed," Elias said, and the plea was less about Silas and more about something like a town. Jed nodded. "Hob rope, but not for hanging. Deacon fetch Doc's kit if he left it last time, and if he didn't, bring whatever looks clean in his office, and wake whoever calls themselves a witness when they're sober. Hob raised an eyebrow. That'll be a short list. But he went. Serafina poured a measure of whiskey into a tin cup and pressed it into Elias's good hand. "Drink," she said. "It will offend the pain into leaving." He drank and coughed and winced and smiled at her like a man being forgiven. Finn stumbled into the doorway with one palm pressed to his bleeding eye and the other lifted like a flag of truce. "Don't shoot," he said, which was a fine way to introduce himself to a table that held a needle and a woman who had just proven she could thread one under pressure. Jed leveled a look at him that did not feature friendship. "He helped," Serafina said quickly. And Finn blinked with the eye not currently arguing with glass. "He can talk," she added. "Tomorrow. Today he can sit." Jed grunted, the universal Western syllable for "I don't like it, but you ain't wrong." He pointed at a chair. Finn sat and stared at his boots like they were the beginning of literature. They worked, those men, the way good men do when dawn is still a rumor. They carried bodies with respect, even when respect had not been earned. They tied hands gently, even when those hands had pointed guns at people who peeled apples and counted nails. They swept glass with their hats off and their mouths quiet. Outside, the first slackening of night began. The east got less black. A bird, foolish and correct, tried a note. Serafina leaned against the wall and let the room stop tilting. She had put the ledger under the stovepipe hood, wrapped in oilcloth against both flame and temptation, and the key back in the pocket where it warmed against her like a tiny, stubborn sundae. Elias's head lolled. He pulled himself back to wakefulness with a small shake that said not yet. "You need to lie down," she said. "Later," he said. "In a town where men choose between law and Silas and decide not to choose, later is a death sentence." "You gave them something else to choose," she said. "We did," he said. The "we did" landed in her chest like a bird that had finally found a branch. Silas was dragged in then, not brutal, not tender, his hands bound, his mouth set in lines that were both injured and sure. He took in the lamp, the table, the ledger's absence from the mantel, and Serafina's bloody apron. His eyes, small, sullen, climbed to Elias. "You think you won a war," he said, "but you just bought a season. Winter comes." "Oh, then we'll build stoves," Serafina said, surprising herself with the ferocity in it. Silas looked at her as if he were trying to subtract her from the equation. He failed. "You," he said, "you're the rot. Pretty rot is still rot." "Rot," she said, chin up. "No, I'm the root. Learn the difference." Jed laughed, slow and satisfied. "That's talk a man can plant corn by. Les." They locked Silas in the little lean-to Elias had once used as a tack room when storms made the main barn grind its teeth, posted Deacon and Hob outside, and let the night, what was left of it, tick like a clock you can't wind back. The neighbors' lamps had become a small constellation in the yard. Low voices traded names, and names traded stories, and stories traded shame and hope in equal handfuls. When at last the door closed, and the men moved away to make daylight's chores out of midnight's crimes, Serafina sank into the chair across from Elias. His skin had gone the gray beneath tan that says the body will keep its promises, but intends to charge interest. She reached across the table. He met her halfway, their fingers lacing with a clumsiness that was better than grace because it was real. "I was afraid," she said. "I like people who are," he said. "They know what they're choosing." "Oh." She let her head tip forward until her forehead found the back of his hand. The room smelled now like coffee pretending it could drown whiskey, and like blood that had decided to dry, and like the lemon oil she had used 2 days ago on the table. Real life argues for itself stubbornly. "Elias," she said into his knuckles, her voice hushed so as not to wake the ache. "Whatever tomorrow is court, ledger, men who won't choose know this one fact. Tonight I didn't break. Lek." He squeezed her fingers. "No," he said. "You didn't." He sagged then, finally allowing the chair to catch the half of him he no longer had the arrogance to hold alone. She rose and eased him to the cot by the hearth. Outside, the windmill chose work again and creaked once, like a back made honest. Serafina pulled the blanket up to Elias's chest, smoothing it like a vow. The ledger waited under the stovepipe, small and arrogant. Dawn leaned its elbow on the sill. Somewhere down the road, the town woke and found that something had happened to it in the night. A woman had become the sort of thing a town could be measured by, and a man had remembered that law is not a book, but a person who will stand between a door and a battering ram. Serafina lay down on the floor by the cot with her arm under her head and her skirt tucked around her calves. She left her hand where it could find Elias's if the dark came back for either of them. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was not a gunshot or a curse, or even a prayer. It was Elias's breathing, steady now, counting something she did not need to know, counts of stitches, counts of men who had come and gone, counts of nights like this and mornings like the one that was coming. The storm had come and gone, and the house still stood. The ledger had not burned, the woman had not broken, the man had not fallen. In the arithmetic of the West, that was not victory. It was proof of concept, and sometimes proof of concept is enough to build a town on. The dawn broke over Blackwood with a cold, indifferent glare. The aftermath of the gunfight was a gruesome spectacle. Serafina, her hands steady despite the lingering tremor in her soul, helped Elias to a chair, then moved to survey the damage. The front of the cabin was a sieve of bullet holes, the windows a jagged ruin of broken glass. The bodies of the outlaws lay like discarded rags on the dusty ground. The smell of blood hung in the air, a grim testament to the violence of the night. Elias, his face pale, watched her from the chair. He had refused to let her tend to his wound properly, insisting it could wait. But she saw the lines of pain etched around his mouth, the way his knuckles were white as he gripped the armrest. She wasn't a doctor, but she knew that a man bleeding was a man in danger. She disappeared for a moment, returning with a needle, thread, and a bottle of whiskey. "I'm not a nurse," she said, her voice low and steady, "but I know how to sew, and you're bleeding. A lot." He stared at the needle, his face a mask of grim determination. "I don't need it," he grumbled. "Just a bit of cleaning." "Elias," she said, her voice a calm, unwavering force, "I won't let you die. Not after you saved me, not after we fought together." She placed a hand on his cheek, her touch gentle but firm. "Please, let me help." Something in her gaze, in her resolve, broke his resistance. He nodded, a single, weary motion. She poured a generous amount of whiskey onto the wound, watching him wince in pain. She began to sew, her hands surprisingly deft and sure. As she worked, she talked, her voice a quiet murmur, a balm against the pain. She told him stories of her childhood in a small, provincial town, of her love for books, and her dreams of a life free from the suffocating expectations of a man's world. He listened, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even. She was stitching his physical wound, but she was also stitching the gaping hole in his soul. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound with a clean rag. The sight of her handiwork, a crude but effective piece of craftsmanship, gave her a sense of pride. He was her responsibility now. She would not let him down. "You're a good woman, Serafina Vance," he said, his voice hoarse. "Much better than I deserve." "Me?" "You're a good man, Elias Thorne," she replied, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. "The best I've ever known." Later that day, Elias, still weak from the loss of blood, summoned a handful of men from the town. They were his friends, his confidants, men who had fought alongside him in the war and had followed him to this desolate land. They were grizzled veterans, their faces etched with the same kind of weariness and resolve that she had seen in Elias. She watched from the doorway as they buried the bodies of the outlaws. There was no ceremony, no prayer. Just the grim, silent work of men who had seen too much death to mourn for the wicked. They were Elias's family, a brotherhood of survivors, a small but formidable army that had come to his aid in a time of need. After they had finished, one of the men, a tall, lanky man named Jed, approached Serafina. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. "Elias told us you helped him. We owe you." "You owe me nothing," she said, her voice filled with a quiet dignity. "I only did what was right." Jed nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Elias doesn't let just anyone into his world, ma'am. You're one of us now." His words, simple and direct, were a profound source of comfort. She was no longer an outsider. She was part of something, a family, a community, a place where honor and loyalty were not just words, but a way of life. The next few days were a blur of activity. The men worked tirelessly to repair the cabin, their hands, once so adept at violence, now moving with a surprising gentleness as